Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to today's webcast. Today's presentation is being recorded, and now I'd like to turn the floor over to Chris Flack. Please go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much, and welcome everybody in our audience to today's webcast, Veeam's Road to GDPR Compliancy, the 5 Lessons Learned Fireside Chat. Today's webcast is sponsored by Veeam and brought to you by RedmondMag.com. I'm Chris Flack, and I'm here just to be your host for today's webcast, so thank you all for joining today's presentation. We greatly appreciate it. Now, just a couple quick reminders before we begin today's presentation and introduce our speakers. Just a few things to cover with everybody. So first things first is we are recording today's event for future viewing and listening purposes. We'll send you a link within 24 hours after today's show where you can view the replay. We encourage you to share that with coworkers, colleagues, friends, anybody who may be interested on today's topic. We would greatly appreciate that. Also, we'll have a, have a Q&A session at the end of today's call. We'll make sure you can get to your question at any time via the Ask a Question box appearing on the left-hand side of your console. Hopefully, if time permits, we'll get to everybody's questions and get out some answers. But please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Don't be shy. We are having a fireside chat today, so it's a little bit more loosely based and not constant slides. So we encourage participation at any point if you have a question for our presenters. So please feel free to participate with us along in today's presentation. Joining us for today's presentation, we have 2 really great presenters. A little bit later on, you're going to hear from Danny Allan. He is the Vice President of Product Strategy over at Veeam. And you also hear from Greg Schulz. He's the founder of StorageIO. Now, just a little bit about the gentleman speaking in today's webcast. Danny is the Vice President of Product Strategy. He envisions, designs, and delivers product strategies and solutions. He partners with enterprise customers and large service providers to assess and ensure long-term industry success. Early in his career, Danny was CTO of Desktone, which was acquired by VMware, Director of Security Research at IBM, and a member of the Security Architecture Board, where he co-authored the IBM Secure Engineering Framework. You can find out more in the link right there on your screen, and there's also going to be resources in your doc where you can find more information as well. But first up today, you're going to hear from Greg Schulz. He's a founder of StorageIO and the author. He is the founder of independent IT analyst firm Server and StorageIO and the author of several books, including Software-Defined Data Infrastructure Essentials. Greg brings a diverse IT customer and vendor perspective with hands-on real-world experiences across applications, data infrastructures, hardware, software, and cloud. He's a Microsoft MVP of Cloud Data Center Management and a 9-time VMware vExpert. And without any further ado, I will hand the presentation over to Greg to get started. So please take the floor, my friend.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Welcome, everybody, to today's discussion, Veeam's Road to GDPR Compliance's 5 Lessons Learned. This is Greg Schulz, and as Chris mentioned, joining me today is Danny Allan, GDPR expert and Veeam Vice President of Product Strategy. Let's get right into this. And as Chris mentioned, this is more of a fireside discussion. It's more interactive. So we want your discussions. We want your conversation. We want you to be involved as a part of this. So it's not going to be death by PowerPoint or death by ooey gooey demo. We do have some slides here that we're going to have for more or less just framing up the discussion as backdrop. And with that, this is what we're going to be talking about today is that journey to GDPR compliance. In other words, GDPR is not a destination. It's the start of a journey that's going to continue to evolve over time that we're going to get some perspectives from Danny on here in just a few minutes. We're going to take a look at the 5 lessons that Veeam themselves learned as a part of their own organization becoming GDPR compliant. Think of this as not just talking the talk, but this is Veeam walking the talk on their own road, on their own journey to GDPR compliance. And then we're going to evolve what those different lessons learned are: know your data, manage the data, protect the data, document, comply, review, and improve. And then we'll move on into additional questions, where to learn more. And with that, let's just get right into it. As I mentioned, GDPR is not a destination. It will be an evolving journey with broad applicability. There's a lot of myths. There's a lot of misperceptions about GDPR, in that it's just regulatory for certain industries or that it only applies to the EU, the European Union. Here's the thing. The new regulations are a starting point of a journey that will evolve over time. And what that means is that your organizations will also need to adopt processes, best practices, reporting, monitoring, notification, as well as enhance your own data protection approach. So with that, I'd like to bring Danny in now, and let's get Danny involved in this conversation. You there, Danny?
I am, Greg. Happy to be here. Thank you.
Great. Hey, Danny, let's just set the stage here before we go into the 5 lessons learned. And let's just talk a little bit about this whole thing around GDPR, Global Data Protection Regulations. And we've got some bullet points there, but let's give us a little bit of color, give us a little bit of perspective around these key points and the applicability that it really is a global. It's not just unique to the EU.
Sure. So GDPR is, I'm sure everyone knows, General Data Protection Regulation. It was really founded off an earlier directive, Data Protection Directive, that was founded back in 95. So it's been around, that directive's been around for a long time and talked about how to protect data. But in 1995, of course, that was at the inception of the Internet, and the concept of smartphones and the Internet didn't even really exist in a mainstream way. And so this is really catching up the regulation as it pertains to data, and it goes into effect, as you see here, on May 25th, 2018. So this isn't something entirely new, though it is switching from a directive to a regulation. People tend to associate the GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation, with just the EU because it certainly concerns the data of EU citizens. However, what we certainly found at Veeam, and what I would encourage everyone to look at, is to consider it a global regulation. The reason is because our world is very flat. We have data with implications that span worldwide. And so even though your organization may be in America or it may be in APJ, there is almost a certainty that you have some data somewhere in your organization that pertains to citizens or folks that are in the European Union. And so it's really a global impact for the organization. One thing that you mentioned... I think
there's a common myth there that when people hear regulations, they think compliance, they think certain industries, whether it be healthcare, whether it be financial, banking. When it comes to GDPR, it knows no boundaries in terms of the type of organization, the type of industry, whether it's a super large enterprise or a small SMB, small office.
Absolutely correct. What I ask organizations is, do you have data? And the answer to that, of course, is yes. And so simply by virtue of the fact of you're storing data, holding data, there is a very significant likelihood that it is impacting you. And like you say, it doesn't matter what vertical or what segment of the industry you're in. There's probably some aspect of it that certainly pertains to you as an organization, certainly pertain to us, obviously.
And Danny, I mean, part of that applicability is when you think about it, that, as you say, the world is flat per se, but it's also multidimensional in that while applicable to organizations of all size across all industries, there's another dimension of GDPR, which is it's not just about human resources, HR. It's not just about the financial or the accounting organization. It also impacts marketing, sales, engineering, procurement. In other words, it's multifaceted even within the organization.
100% correct. There's some things that, as you might expect, there's a higher likelihood of having what is known as sensitive information. So in HR, for example, they have my name, my address, my banking information, for example. But there's other parts of the organization where maybe it's not sensitive information, but they're still collecting data. If you have a website, for example, there's probably people visiting that website from European Union or places like that. And so it impacts every part of the organization from HR to sales to marketing to you name it. There's an impact that is very, very broad.
Danny, let's start to transition here about the 5 lessons in that as a part of Veeam becoming compliant for your own particular business organization needs, which happens to be in the business of data protection. Could you give us the quick highlight? What are the 5 lessons, and then we'll dig into each of those.
Sure. So one of the first things that we said was, hey, I want to become GDPR compliant. And First of all, as you say, it's not a destination. It's certainly a journey. And as we went through that, it became very apparent that there was kind of 5 steps in this journey that we had to partake or go through. The first was to know our data, to understand it, and we'll dive into that a little bit more. But the first stage was simply understanding and knowing the data that we had. Secondly, it was how do we manage that data? Thirdly, it was how do we then protect the data beyond just management? How do we protect it and ensure compliance? Stage 4 was then, if we're going to protect it, then how do I document that and ensure that I can provide attestation or compliance? And then lastly, the ongoing improvement. As you mentioned, it is not a destination but a journey, and so how do we iterate, how do we increment on what we've learned to date and feed that back into the system. So the 5 steps were know your data, manage your data, protect your data, document and comply with the process, and then finally ongoing improvement.
Great, thanks, Danny. Hey, let's get into it a little bit more. If you want to call it step 1 or lesson 1, but know your data. I mean, it should be fundamental. It should be one of those things that should be really obvious, but it's so common that organizations really don't understand all of their data, all the different attributes, all of the different characteristics, whether it be the identify, the access, the location, things like that. But Danny, share some of your thoughts, some of your findings around know your data.
Sure. So as you mentioned, most organizations, and this was certainly true at Veeam initially, we didn't have a good grasp on what that data was or where it was. And the reason for that is over the last, I'm going to say, decade, data has no longer just been restricted or segmented to our own data centers. It has begun to sprawl in this multi-cloud world where we have SaaS services, for example, for customer relationship management, for human resource information systems. We sometimes go out to these SaaS services, and then now we're beginning to see the adoption of public cloud. And so you might have lines of business who say, I'm not going to consume services from inside my data center. I'm going to go out to the public cloud. And so there's consumption from public cloud. And then, of course, there is the internal data center. And then, you're interacting with partners, and sometimes they're collecting data on your behalf. And so getting your hands around just understanding the breadth and scope of all the data that drives the business on a daily basis is a significant challenge. And so part of that knowing the data for us was, first of all, to identify the types of data that we were using within our organization, and then where it was actually located. And so that was a significant process for us, and I would argue probably the most substantial because it was the first step on this journey for Veeam.
So Danny, as a part of that journey, part of knowing and learning and revisiting and rediscovering, what surprises did you come across?
Well, one of the things that I didn't expect was to find personal data for citizens of the EU outside of the EU. My expectation was that, yes, in the typical locations where we would expect to find that. So in CRM systems, we would have customer data associated with the customers that are in the EU. That's fairly straightforward. I knew that in HR systems, we would have personal data perhaps for employees that were in the EU, but I wasn't expecting to find customer data, for example, of citizens in the EU outside of the EU. And one of the things that we quickly uncovered, we created these internal surveys that we sent out. And what we uncovered was that even in regional marketing organizations, so in the Americas or over in the APJ, they were holding these regional marketing events. They actually themselves also had personal data of citizens of the EU, and that's because, the web is open to anyone. And so you'd have a citizen of Germany or a citizen of Spain registering for a webinar that was being hosted out of America or being hosted out of APJ. And so it was surprising to us to find out that these regional events actually led to data collection and information, data being housed in these locales outside of the European Union.
Great. So, Danny, as a part of this journey, this discovery and learning things, what are some lessons, what are some tips tied into knowing your data, knowing your information?
So one of the things I always tell organizations is don't make assumptions. We made the assumption that most of the customer data would be in our central CRM system or employee data in the HRIS. Don't make assumptions that that's where it's going to be. When you send out, or maybe back up a step, create surveys that are ubiquitous across the organization so that you can send them out and get a consistent understanding of where that data may be. And so kind of the first recommendation or important tip here is to make sure that you have consistency across regional and non-EU business units to find out where that data is. Another thing that I would suggest is it's helpful to create flow charts in understanding the data to map the flow of that data across the organization, because often there's third-party partners involved. Might be a marketing system, it might be a sales system. But map out the process and the flow of data, because you want to understand where your boundaries are and where the boundaries of your partners actually are.
That's great to know. And as a part of knowing your data, it's also knowing about the regulations, as we talked about, when it goes into effect, who it applies to, and also the fact that it is applicable to outside the EU. But in the U.S., what's being done to enforce GDPR in the U.S., if anything?
Well, it's making sure that the policies that we've implemented are in place. And so that, if you jump forward to the last one, we've iterated and incremented on our understanding of the applicability of this, but we make sure that the policies are in place across the organization. So even if we're talking about a system that is not EU-centric, but that could house EU data, the same policies apply to them. And so for every event, for example, that occurs, whether it be in the EU or not in the EU, we apply those same regulations and classification for data.
Great. Well, the next lesson, the next step as a part of the Veeam journey to GDPR compliance is managing your data. Managing your data means so many different things to different people, whether it be tagging, understanding that differences, leveraging that insight awareness that you just talked about, Danny. But what are some other attributes of managing your data?
Sure. So there was really three questions that we tried to answer on the managing the data. So once we identified it all, then we began to get our hands around it. And really the three questions which we tried to grapple with was who has access to the information and know when they're accessing it. And there's certainly legitimate reasons for that. So you have marketing organizations, for example, that are running an event, like this webinar, for example, and have understanding who has access to that data and know when they're accessing it was number one. Number two is why do they need access to that information? Because if it was possible to restrict access, if there was not a legitimate business need, then it was easier to ensure that they didn't get that access. So to document why exactly they needed the access, and lastly, what is that purpose? So it was very much around access control when it came to managing our data. And what we found is that the different departments within our organization each processed it for their own unique reasons. Marketing, of course, for marketing, sales for selling, human resources because there was employees in these different locations. So understanding and then setting the management restrictions around who had access, why do they need access, and what was the purpose became very much a part of the second phase of managing the data. And one thing to highlight here, we partner with third parties, as you might imagine, for some of these capabilities, things like marketing. We have a third party involved, and so we needed to make sure that we assessed that third party as well for their GDPR compliance, because even if the data was not in our system, we still had to do that management of the data.
So, I mean, that sounds like that was a little bit of a surprise finding as well, is that you understood the data was out there, but not only how it was intermingled, but how it was used, how it's accessed, that in itself, that activity was also, or is also intermingled.
Yeah, we didn't, going into it, my expectation is that there would be a clear segmentation between general data, personal data, and sensitive data, each of which has a specific descriptor within the GDPR. And what we found is it's not black and white. General data was mixed up or intermingled with sensitive data with personal data. And so it makes for far better management if these types of things can be separated logically. Now, that's not always possible. And so understanding what that data is, the management of it really becomes more valuable or easier to achieve if you can really be specific as to why do they need this data and what is the purpose of it. That allows you to manage it far easier.
Okay. So talking about managing, Danny, we've got a question here, which is, hypothetically, if 85% of the world is too lazy to comply with GDPR, how will the EU enforce its worldview about what privacy and data protection should mean?
Well, there's penalties, of course, associated with GDPR, which are substantial. In fact, the single word that hits home the most to me is the word greater, because the penalty is the greater of either 20 million euros or 4% of the global annual turnover. So 20 million euros is obviously a substantial number, but 4% of global annual turnover can be even more substantial if you're a large global organization. And so that is really the impact of this. Now, I know some people throw that around as FUD, and we haven't reached May 25th yet, so we don't know how aggressive or non-aggressive they will be in prosecuting this. However, what I wouldn't want to be is the organization to find out what that really means to the business.
So, I mean, there are some teeth, because this is the regulation. There are teeth to it, and the teeth to it, that enforcement, are those monetary fines that are tied to revenue.
Yes, exactly. And Veeam, of course, being a large global organization with substantial revenue, you can see why this becomes a very strategic and important conversation internally. And so, for example, when we come to managing the data, just saying, hey, you're an administrator, you have access to everything, no longer was sufficient. And that was actually one of the interesting findings out of managing the data, was that sometimes an administrator would have access to absolutely everything. And if you're really trying to answer those questions of why do they have access to it and what is the purpose, if it's simply because I'm an admin, that's not necessarily a good answer. And so managing the data became an important part of scoping down that access. And the reason is, as you say, you don't want to be in the wrong end of those teeth.
Yeah, I think that is probably one of those things that might be glossed over, but that's how you get the attention. With classic data protection, people talk about downtime and disruption and things like that. But when you start looking at it from what is that revenue impact, what is that impact in not only the top but the bottom line of an organization, all of a sudden now you're going to get those people with chief whatever officer type roles. That's where you're going to get their attention.
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So we've talked about know your data, know your information, and about managing it. Let's continue the conversation. Let's continue this discussion, because it is about global data protection regulation. Let's dig into a little bit more about protecting your data. Protect, preserve, serve, secure your information. And, it certainly gets into security, auditing, vulnerability monitoring. But talk to us a little bit more, Danny, about some of the lessons learned in protecting your data. Now that you've identified it, you're managing it.
So what we learned around protection of data is the importance of consistency in security. I myself spent a decade in the security industry doing vulnerability assessment. And so, the mindset was, hey, I can do a vulnerability assessment and I'm done. But actually applying vulnerability assessment or applying data access restrictions is very much more difficult in the real world, where data is not just in a single location but is sprawled both internally inside my own data centers, externally within my control, for example, public cloud, or externally less within my control, things like SaaS services. And so applying consistent security restrictions and applying consistent assessment is a very much more difficult thing to do, I learned, in the real world. And so while it's important to have all of these security gates in place, ensuring that you have them in place across the breadth of the organization becomes the key. And that's not just the proactive protection of the data. It's also, the reactive protection of the data. It's also the proactive. In the event of a breach, for example, most compliance regulations require you to enable notification of consumers or have notification of individuals. And so making sure you have proactive notification mechanisms in place also becomes very important when it comes to protecting the data.
So, Danny, when you say consistency, some would say, well, just treat everything the same. As a part of your findings, did you find that you have to be consistent in what you apply, consistent in how you deploy, based on what you've identified? But does that mean treat everything the same?
No, everything gets treated, there is no the same as you might expect. And it's because of the many different axes of data. So there's the axes of what is the type of data. Is it general data? Is it personal data? Is it sensitive data? Each of those requires different levels of security control, for example. But then even within, we'll take something like personal data. Even within that, what you'll find is that because data lives in different systems with different types of performance requirements, to take a simple example, some of our systems, because we need very performant systems, are on all flash arrays, and other ones are less frequently accessed, and so they might be on disk or they might be on different models of storage. And so even trying to apply consistency of security protections across these different physical systems, and there's an absolute business need for that, becomes a challenge. And so while it's easy to say the word consistency, you really have to focus on the consistency of the policy rather than implementation, because the implementation ends up being different depending on the type of storage, the location of the storage, the type of data, the geography that it lives in. And that's obviously one of the challenges around applying protection.
So, Danny, that ties back to what we talked about in that lesson number 2, managing your data, those 3 key points of understanding who has access and when, why do they have access, and what is the access, what is the purpose of that access, to define your policies, to tie that in to how you're going to consistently protect.
Yeah, and so one of the things, for example, that I found was interesting in tying the managing to the protecting, it's easy to say, well, the administrator doesn't get access to the data, but then they're an administrator of the system, so how can you prevent access? And so one of the things, for example, that we suggest and began looking at was implementing things like the 2-man rule. We're all familiar with, or maybe not, but there's a movie, Crimson Tide, where it took 2 people to turn the key in order to make an event take place. The same thing for data access. It may be that the administrator needs access to a system, obviously, to manage it, but perhaps implementing things like a 2-man rule where access is not just within the hands of a single individual, but multiple individuals, so that you can audit and apply greater protections of that personal data, and certainly personal sensitive data, which is of a higher degree of sensitivity as defined by the GDPR.
That's a good point, Danny, is that enabling the workers, enabling the admins to do their job, giving them the authentication, whether you're using an Active Directory, group policies, whether you're using that or some other mechanism, but give the people the capability they need, but they don't need anything more than what they need to get the job done.
Great point, because we sometimes look at security or regulations as an inhibitor of business, but we always have to start with the business is in the industry of making money and growing the business. And so we still want to support that primary objective of growing the business and making the organization successful. But we need to do that with the appropriate security controls, privacy controls, and compliance with regulations like the General Data Protection Regulation.
So certainly you've got the monitoring, the auditing, the security, those different access, protecting the data both from a security standpoint, but also protecting it. But there's an interesting theme in here that I believe, one of our prior conversations we talked about, which is protecting by design, both from a security, but making sure things are backed up, recoverable, snapshots, all those other things. But doing it proactively by design as opposed to reactively.
It's an important point that you raise and is often missed. If you go back 10 years in the security industry, there was this concept of let me bolt security onto my infrastructure or into my application. And what that resulted in was very complex workflows, and it was not consistent. And about 10 years ago, there was a movement called building security in, and they came out with a maturity model, building security and maturity model, which addressed not just the workflows, but also the intelligence, the enablement and education of individuals, the ongoing analytics and monitoring. There was 4 different domains to that building security and maturity model. And my belief is that we need something very similar for privacy, and I make a very important and what I believe is strategic distinction between security and privacy. Security being about the organization protecting the data, privacy about the rights being transferred to the individual. And so if you go through GDPR, there's all these articles in there. There's the right to rectification, the right to be forgotten, the right to restriction of processing, the right to data portability. The important part of that is to take all of those rights and to build them into our systems from the very beginning rather than being reactive. That ultimately will result in a much better outcome for the person that this is all about, which is the individual, the data subject, having the rights that they demand or require for the business. And so building that in ultimately ends up with a far better outcome for the business and for the individual.
That's great. Thanks, Danny. And as a reminder to everybody, continue to submit your questions. We've got some great ones that we've been working into the discussion as we're going along. Keep those going. Also the reminder that this is being recorded, so you can play it back later, listen to it, share it with your coworkers, your friends, your neighbors. But also there'll be the replay as well as the download, the actual PDF version of this. Danny, you mentioned something interesting that I found interesting in there, which is that protection versus privacy, but what caught my ear was removing complexity, which I like because whenever you remove complexity, you reduce overhead and you reduce cost, as opposed to simply cost cutting. Let's use that as a transition into documenting and complying, not for the sake of going through and documenting with overhead, but as a way to streamline, leveraging those lessons learned so far of that insight, that awareness, of that managing and that proactive protecting of your data. Let's get into the document and comply.
Yeah, so documentation, or to back up a moment, the simplicity comment that you made, is very much in the DNA of Veeam. We always focus just on the software side around make things easy and you make things better. And the same is true when it comes to GDPR and documentation. If you make it easy for them to understand what they need to do and how to do it, then it ends up in a much more simplified process for the organization. And that process can be as simple as, for example, one of the rights within GDPR is the right to be forgotten. Well, how do you know where the data for that individual is? You need to make it simple to be able to search across all of that data and to apply the right of erasure or the right to be forgotten. And so simplifying the process around that becomes the key to eliminating the complexity of going across all these systems and doing individual searches. And so that was very much a significant part of what we had to go through, is how do we centralize and simplify so that when the data subject exercised one of the rights that we could actually implement it.
Okay, that's a great perspective. And, as a part of that, certainly there's tied back to knowing your data is you got to do some searching, there's transferring information. So there's, in all these different steps, all these different lessons, is it correct to say that there is interdependency? It's not necessarily serial from one to the other, that they're all interrelated.
Very much interrelated, and some things are not even in effect now. For example, one of the things that we learned, one of the surprising aspects of this, we obviously play in the availability space where we have the 3-2-1 rule, or some people call it the 4-3-2-1 rule, but moving data from one place to another is inherent to our DNA as an organization. In fact, we help organizations all the time in disaster recovery scenarios, for example, to move the data from on-premises to a cloud provider. Well, understanding that workflow and documenting that workflow becomes critical, because if you were to go through a disaster, then you need to understand that the data for that EU citizen may no longer be inside your data center. The data on that EU citizen may now be on a managed cloud or a public cloud provider. And so documenting the workflow around data movement and how that might impact you in the future is equally important, because even though it doesn't come into effect now in the event of a disaster, then it certainly would.
So that ties into, I think you touched on this, Danny, is that there's having that insight that to enable your GDPR planning, deployment, and ongoing management and adjustment, that applies directly over to how you're running your normal data protection, your backup, your BCDR, all those other aspects of the organization. So in other words, it helps, and it's not just overhead for one.
Exactly. And it's not just disaster recovery, as you point out, it's backup as well. If someone exercises the right to be forgotten, and so you eliminate the data, but then 2 weeks later the database administrator needs to do a restoration of the database, how do you deal with that, right? So it's disaster recovery, it's backup, it's how do these concepts around the rights of the data subject apply in normal day-to-day workflows or in disaster recovery type workflows.
Let me work a question in here from the attendees, Danny, which is, are there examples available for the right to consent, the right to forget, and the right to remove data from, as a part of the whole GDPR regulation and initiatives?
We certainly have already had data subjects exercising those rights, pardon me, with Veeam, and so they contact us, and so we put in place the processes and documented the processes on how to apply those rights, and so the right to be forgotten. Now, one thing to be aware of is, and it will be an interesting journey as we move forward, I always say that we're on a collision course at some point between security and privacy, because a data subject may exercise the right to be forgotten, but other regulations may prohibit that. To take a very tactical example, you said, give me an example of this. It may be that I come in and I say I would like to apply for a home loan, and so I borrow several $100,000 from the bank or whatever it is, and then 2 weeks later I can't say I want to exercise my right to be forgotten and I no longer have to pay my mortgage back. And so there is this collision course going forward over security regulations and the need to retain data with the rights of the individual to be forgotten. And at some point that will cause friction in the future, but we haven't hit that point quite yet.
Great. So let's work another question in here as we go. Is there a difference between consent, B2C, and legitimate business interest, B2B?
Definitely. So I'm sure that many folks on the phone or listening to this are aware of, you go to certain websites and you get that little pop-up that says, do you accept with the cookie policy, and you consent to that, or do you consent to data being tracked, and yes or no. And so you can choose opt-in or opt-out of that. However, in a B2B scenario, I may be doing business. We are doing business, Veeam, with many of our key partners. And it may be that they cannot opt out of us collecting that data for legitimate business purposes. We need to track joint sales or marketing or things that are essential to our business portfolio. And so there's definitely a distinction on consent between a B2C market and a B2B market.
All right. So let's transition. We'll keep this conversation going as we move on to our next aspect, which is the ongoing, the review and improve. In other words, as we've talked about, GDPR, it's not the destination. The finish line is not May 25th. That's the starting line. And that's where, again, we're going back through these steps, ongoing to review and improve the whole aspect around the GDPR as part of that journey. Danny, if you could share with us some key points about ongoing improvement, the review and improve.
Sure. So as you say, May 25th starting line, not the finish line, and it is about iterating and incrementing on the implementation of GDPR policies. And we've already done numerous rounds of this. So to take a very specific example, we didn't initially in our surveys, we didn't have consistency in surveys. We had a deeper level of questioning, for example, for data subjects that were in the EU for regional marketing teams within the EU versus outside. What we quickly learned, obviously, was that that isn't the model. What we really needed to be doing is being globally consistent because data could live anywhere. And so that's just a simple example of the survey actually changed from month 1 to month 2. And one of the great things that we've done as a technology industry, ignoring software for a moment, just in general, we've moved much more towards that iterate and increment model, whether it be software development through agile models or, DevOps people talk about, which is being able to respond more quickly. That concept does tend to be ingrained in organizations. But what I would suggest and submit to folks is they need to apply this to their policies around GDPR so that if they're doing things like surveys, if they're doing things like analytics, that they implement a process or a workflow that it can be updated quickly, responding to whether it be changes in GDPR regulations or to mandates of that regulation, or just within the organization as it evolves. Take an example of many global organizations are acquiring other companies at a rapid rate. How do you iterate and increment to make sure that you're inclusive of the new organization that you just acquired as you go through the process? So it's very much fundamental, or it should be fundamental to every organization to continue to learn, evolve, and update the policies and workflows.
That's a really good perspective, Danny, is keep your policies, keep your rules, keep those up to date, because those are going to continue to evolve as you work things. And that whole speed, doing it quickly. Danny, we got a question in here, which is around, and you touched on this a little bit, about data retention, data protection aspect of GDPR. Is there a publicity aspect? I think that ties into the reporting, the notifications, having those dashboards, and to be able to do that quickly.
There is absolutely an aspect of publicity associated with this. And in my mind, there's kind of a fork in the road. If you go out and you say, hey, I am GDPR compliant, on one hand, that puts a big target on you for people to test that out. We've seen that in security implementations where someone says, I'm secure, and all of a sudden they become a target. If you say I'm GDPR compliant, then you may get people probing that. And so while you may not want to paint a target on you, I do believe kind of the other fork that you need to have in place is all of the mechanisms to respond to that first request of I want to be forgotten, or the auditor who comes in to say, I would like to make sure that you're in compliance with the regulation. So both of those are important aspects as it pertains to publicity. I wouldn't go out and broadcast it, but you have to be ready for it at any given time because you never know when you may be asked to deal with a situation.
So, okay, Danny, you brought it up, walking the talk. And that's a good point about broadcasting, but also being forthright about it, is that Veeam is stepping up. Veeam is sharing the lessons learned. Veeam may, in fact, be somebody, as you mentioned, will test to see what Veeam is. You've indicated that you're prepared. What can you share with us, any other lessons that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, that was an important thing for us as an organization, and the reason to lead with what we have done around GDPR, and the reason was we saw a lot of marketing speak, if you will, in the industry that said, we can make you GDPR compliant, or we are the answer to your problems. And our belief was and is that there is no single technology that can make you GDPR compliant, that this is a process that is very complex and it spans people and platforms and processes and procedures within the organization. And so certainly technology is a part of this, but we want people to be thinking beyond just, I'll buy this software or I'll implement this particular workflow, into the full breadth of what it really takes to be compliant. And we find ourselves working with very large enterprises or with very large cloud service providers who are struggling with what is the scope of that breadth, and can you give us some very practical guidance based on what you've been through. And that was really our motivation, is to help our partners, help the industry in some of these more complex areas.
That's a great point, which is, and we do see a lot of that out there, is a lot of organizations, a lot of others are out there. They're talking the talk, but they're not walking that talk. And you can't walk the talk if you haven't actually done it. So I think that in itself is testament to your preparedness and what is being shared with the listeners today. Danny, a question here is, what about data encryption, data encrypted at rest in transit? Are there any special points or any special considerations regarding data being encrypted with GDPR?
Yes, well, certainly security, protecting the data applies to data both at rest and in motion. And so, I can talk at length about making sure you have AES 256-bit encrypted data, every time it sits on a disk and any time it moves between point A and point B. But the broader part of that, the broader story is not just the data between systems and the data as it sits on a system, but understanding the full scope of that data flow, because sometimes that data doesn't just live within your four walls. If you take something as simple as marketing data and cookies, for example, it may be that data is within your organization, but it's also going out to a partner. And so understanding the data flows and documenting that becomes critical in order to ensure that end-to-end data security.
And we've got another question here that ties into that, which is, who within an organization, especially if it's a larger one, a larger global organization for that matter, leads the GDPR Compliancy initiative? Is it a single accountable person, or should there be a new position, a new role designated to take the lead? Does it need to be a lawyer? Does it need to be finance? Does it need to be the CEO, the board? Give us a little bit of guidance on your own lessons there, Danny, about who should be at the point of the GDPR rollout.
So GDPR specifies a unique role, DPO, Data Protection Officer, that I guess ultimately takes accountability for that. And I guess in full disclosure, I've been designated as that individual for Veeam. However, it's not a single individual. There's a team approach that is required for this, because there is certainly the folks that understand what the data is and what the data flows look like, and that's not typically someone on the legal side, for example. And so the CIO will probably best have the responsibility and accountability for where is the data, who has access to it, where does it flow. And so our CIO is very much involved in this effort. One of the spearheading components at Veeam, individuals on the task force, was also our legal counsel, our general counsel, who is the head of the legal team, because there are legal implications to this and potentially, as you mentioned, financial aspects or ramifications to it. And so legal is also involved. And then there's a whole team of individuals underneath that as well. But I would strongly recommend a team approach, and of course HR, I forgot to mention them. In every organization that has employees in the European Union, there's not only personal data, but there is sensitive data associated with employees. And so very much a team effort between HR, between the CIO who's running the systems, between legal counsel to understand the legal aspects of this, and also alliance partners. I don't want to forget them. We also involved heavily the folks from alliances, because we have all of these partnerships that are also very strategic to us, but certainly impact our GDPR footprint.
That's a really good point, and congratulations, Danny, by the way, on being named is it Veeam or the Virtual Chief Data Protection Officer? But I like that.
Yes.
GDPR spans different aspects of an organization. I think that is the essence of it, which you just described, Danny, is that it's a task force. It's a virtual team of different entities from across the organization. It's not just HR, it's not just finance, it's not just IT. It's all those groups working together.
Yes. And that becomes very important as we move forward into the iteration phase, where we update and iterate on these things, because a lot of the monitoring and dashboards will be specific to the task of what that data is for. You have different dashboards and data sets in HR, for example, than you do in marketing, than you do in sales. And so having that virtual cross-functional task force helps you to iterate and update as you move forward.
Right. Danny, would a existing IT administrator who handles network server security be appropriate to be signed as a data protection officer?
Certainly, I wouldn't put boundaries around who could or could not be the data protection officer. And the reason for that is what you're really looking for is a cross-functional role who can round up all the different folks and get everyone in a room and in agreement. And that could be anywhere within the organization. Until you reach a certain size, of course, a DPO is not even required, but I always suggest to organizations that they start thinking about it early on, because it may be that does become a requirement in the future.
Well, and there's the other aspect there, correct me if I'm wrong, Danny, that the data protection officer doesn't have to be just focused on GDPR. That point can also be for just enforcing regular data protection, whether it be backups, BCDR, other aspects of data protection.
No question. There is a wide range, a plethora of compliance regulations that organizations fall under. If you're processing transactions, you're probably falling under the PCI DSS, the data security standard. If you're in health, HIPAA, and certainly just backup and BCDR and the movement of data off premises. If you're a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, understanding where that data is going, all of this is applicable. And so even if GDPR, well, I shouldn't say even if GDPR is a part of what you're doing, it's almost a certainty that GDPR is only a small part, but growing substantially part of what you're tasked with. I always believe in looking at both privacy and security holistically rather than just trying to tick a box. Better to implement systems that provide security for the organization, that provide privacy for the data subjects, and then you can map your regulatory and compliance requirements against that.
Great. So we've got time for a couple more questions as we start to wrap up this discussion today. And again, as a reminder, go ahead and ask your questions. We'll get to those that we can. Those that we're not able to address during the session, they'll be followed up upon. And also that reminder, today's session, today's discussion is being recorded so you can replay it. You can download the attachments. You can download the various content to see what's going on. And part of that content is, which should be up on your screen, which is some various resources that Veeam has, including a great blog series that Danny has written on the lessons learned, as well as more information on the Veeam GDPR site. You can see some examples of the content there. I think the site is veeam.com/GDPR, but correct me if I'm wrong, Danny, what the actual URL is.
Yeah, it should be up on the screen. And I am not looking at it live, but that sounds right.
The attendees can download the PDF of this, and it looks like there's a link that they can click on that will then take them to the Veeam GDPR resource site where you can see all the good info. Likewise, there are content that you can download from the webinar platform, including the PDF, as well as links to additional material. Hey, Danny, we've got a moment here where we can start to wrap up, start to work in some closing thoughts, but we've got another question here, which is, we've talked about the penalties, we've talked about the focus, different size organizations. Are there any exceptions or lesser penalties for nonprofit organizations?
I am not aware of any. I looked at this in the context of Veeam, of course, so I'm not aware of lesser penalties. Maybe you know that better than I do.
Well, my understanding of it is that even though somebody's a nonprofit, that since a nonprofit has business involvement, that there are penalties. Again, one of the things around the GDPR, the regulations that are tied to revenue, they are tied to the amount of that revenue, which could be large for a big organization, they could be small for smaller organizations. In other words, it adapts to different organizations of different types and sizes, as opposed to providing loopholes.
Yes, and the way the penalty is written is it's the greater of 20 million euros or 4% of the annual gross turnover. And so if you're a higher education, for example, I'm working with one right now who is actually, interestingly, American-based, but has students that are overseas. And even though their revenue may not be substantial, the greater of those two certainly would be 20 million euros. And so it would apply to them equally, I believe.
Great. Danny, we're about out of time. It seems we're just getting warmed up, and we could probably go on for hours. Give us a quick closing tip, closing thought, closing recommendation. So
I always believe that every journey begins with the first step. And so when people say to me, what is the most important factor, where are the areas that we should focus, I would go back to the very first step in our journey, which is know your data. Go and do that discovery of what is my data and where is it located. And then as quickly as you can, really kind of the second step would be the management of that. And that really goes back to those three questions that we had to ask ourselves, which were who has access to this information, why do they have access, and what is the purpose. And if you can just do those two things, that is the first step in the journey. Know the data and start to manage the data is probably the most critical aspect of this journey that you're about to embark on.
Great. A lot of good information here, a lot of good insight. And again, this is just the start. This is just the start of this journey. Danny, hey, thank you very much for your time. Really enjoyed the conversation. Look forward to follow-up conversations.
Likewise. Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it.
Great. So on behalf of myself, Greg Schulz, Danny Allan of Veeam, I'd like to thank you all for participating in Veeam's Road to GDPR Compliancy, the 5 Lessons Learned Fireside Chat. And with that, I'll pass it back to Chris. Okay.
Hey. That was great, guys. Thank you so much. That was really entertaining and a lot of fun. And Danny, thank you so much for the great information. And Greg, just an awesome job hosting the webcast. Thank you guys for both your time today. That was a lot of fun. Everybody in the audience, thank you for coming out as well. We'll send you an email with all sorts of different resources that you saw today in the webcast. They're also on the console, so as you exit, you can take a copy of them with you. But please feel free to contact us if you need anything. If we didn't get to your questions, I'll make sure I highlight them and make sure the guys over at Veeam, and if the question was for Greg, I'll make sure Greg gets it. But thank you so much, everybody in the audience, for your attendance today. Today's webcast has been sponsored by Veeam, brought to you by redmondmag.com. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care.